Hi again, guys. Welcome back. Um, we're starting week 6 now in our course. So we're just about coming up to the halfway point in the term. And at this point, we are beginning, as you know, a new module, the third module in our course, to which I have given a rather silly and ungrammatical title. Sorry about that, but what we are learning about, or what we're going to look into over these next couple of weeks, is the very, very important historical and cultural phenomenon of Renaissance humanism. And that's what I want to introduce today with the help of Ben Jonson. Humanism, as some of you guys will know, is a technical term of the history of literature and culture. And when we say it's a technical term, that means that word does not necessarily mean what we think it means initially or immediately when we start talking about it. It has a special meaning in the study of early modern European and English literature and culture. And again, that's something that I want to introduce today and get clear today with Jonson's help. And just before we start that main part of the work of this lecture, again, we're almost at the halfway point of a course where or in which we are working from the end, as you know, from the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century, the beginning of a world that is recognizably modern in a number of respects, one of which is, as we have discussed, the seemingly broad impulse in that end of the early modern period to move or try to get beyond ordinary human language as the matrix, the mechanism for communication and for knowledge, and into or toward seemingly superior, more powerful, more scientific, more automatable mechanisms and systems, which we can bring under the heading of various kinds of information technology, and we can bring under the heading of the very concept of information, that is to say, the concept of, knowable and communicable stuff, which is expressed in language, but not necessarily identical with language, but rather subsisting beyond it or beneath it, or whatever metaphor you would want to use. So to ask our question again, if that's what's happening at the end of the early modern period, various attempts to get beyond the communicative level of language, where does that impulse come from in the period itself? And that's what that's the question that we're not necessarily trying to answer in this course, but on which we're trying to gain some perspectives from within the early modern period. And one of those perspectives, accordingly, that we absolutely have to take up and learn about is the perspective of Renaissance humanism. And that's what we are going to do. Okay, what is it and what isn't it? Well, when we start talking about Renaissance humanism, one thing we need to get clear about right away, right off the bat, is that that term doesn't just mean kind of the ism of the human or anything like that, or thinking humans are important or anything like that. Humanism in the Renaissance / early modern context designates a specific cultural and especially literary movement, basically consisting in the rigorous study of the classical literature of ancient Greece and Rome, the literature and the culture of ancient Greece and Rome, and more broadly, the rigorous study of literature and culture as such, but on that classical template. We call it humanism, and in the period it would have been called, for example, the study of human letters, phrases like that. In the first place, via a certain contrast, a contrast with sacred letters or sacred literature, the literature, in other words, of the Bible and of Christian tradition surrounding the Bible. So, the clearest way to tell this story is to roll it back a little bit as far as the medieval period and generalizing a great deal. We can observe that in the medieval period we will find a certain attitude among the learned to what is and is not worth reading. And in a way it's very simple. There's really only one book worth reading from the perspective of certainly Augustinian medieval Christianity, and that book is the Bible. You want to read the Bible because A, it's written by God, and B, since it's written by God, it's true. Once you have the Bible, as Augustine will say, once you have the Bible, why do you need all that other stuff? Virgil and Tacitus and Ovid and Homer. You don't need that stuff anymore because that stuff isn't true. And although you may be able to get something out of it, you have to do so much work through allegory and so on. Just read God's book. That makes way more sense. So for that medieval attitude, that I'm, of course, simplifying egregiously, but nonetheless, I think it'll work for us. For that kind of medieval attitude, the only literature there's any point in studying is sacred literature, the literature of the Bible, the literature of the church. That attitude then is challenged in the early Renaissance period, challenged beginning in the 14th century by people like Petrarch and later, or Erasmus and Thomas More and Luther, for that matter, Melanchthon. That attitude is challenged in such a way that people say, hang on, no, I think there's something really still worth learning, something very much worth learning from the literature of the ancient pagans. It's human literature by definition because those guys didn't have God. That's the idea. Didn't know Christ, weren't Christian. So it's not sacred literature, it's human letters, but the attitude of Renaissance humanism is nonetheless, there's a great deal to be learned from the study of human letters. And so again, as I said at the beginning of this part of my remarks, humanism, in the first place, it means the rigorous study of the literature and culture of ancient Greece and Rome. More broadly, it means the rigorous study of literature in general and of the literary activity in general. A cultural program, also very much a pedagogic program, an educational program, in other words. So by the mid-16th century, certainly by the time Shakespeare was a child, all primary and secondary education in England is rigorously humanist, which means it's totally literary education, which may sound like a dream come true to some of us, and certainly if you read Shakespeare, you're reading somebody who, although Shakespeare didn't go to university, but his grammar school education in Stratford has given him an excellent humanist preparation to be a brilliant playwright. Some of that humanist education probably would not have thrilled us too much. Later in this unit, we're going to read a little bit of a work by a guy called Roger Ascham, one of the great English humanists of the 16th century. And he's going to teach us about the technique of double translation, which kept the 16th century humanist schoolroom busy. Double translation is when you give, little kids, 10 years old or whatever, you give them a piece of Virgil in Latin, and they have to go translate it into English and then translate it back into Latin. The idea being you're trying to reconstitute Virgil without making too many mistakes. Probably not too thrilling, but in any case, that is what we are talking about in the most basic sense when we are talking about Renaissance humanism, a core feature of the early modern intellectual landscape. and certainly an aspect of the early modern intellectual landscape that is totally obsessed with and focused on the phenomenon of human language and the possibilities, the functions, the limits, the purposes, the rules of expression in language, certainly including literary expression. For Renaissance humanists, literature is a very, very serious business, and certainly it is that for Ben Jonson, with whose help today and this week we want to fill in some of the details of that very general and brief sketch I just gave of what the heck we're talking about when we're talking about Renaissance humanism. And we can do that usefully with Jonson's help in the first place because Jonson certainly is a very fine humanist, and it matters to him a great deal to be able to claim that he is a very fine humanist. And in part, for a guy like Jonson, that craving, as it were, for humanism in the period sense, in part, there is a class element to that in the case of a guy like Jonson, a man who basically came from a good family, not an aristocratic family by any means, but a gentlemanly family, but a family that felt kind of on hard times. His father died, his mother remarried, down really, such that Jonson himself was apprenticed as a young man to be a bricklayer. And then through very much his own efforts, his own brilliance, his own dedication, trained himself, taught himself to be a very fine humanist poet. So there is that, but overwhelmingly, when we're looking at somebody like Jonson, we're just looking at somebody who absolutely and sincerely, I think we can say, reverences the humanist project of the late 16th and early 17th centuries. That is the kind of person he wants to be. That is the kind of poetry he wants to write. Humanist poetry, which again does not necessarily mean approachable poetry, does not necessarily mean caring poetry, although I think Jonson does actually care about us. But it means learned poetry. It means, as we'll see from Jonson, it means appropriately disciplined poetry. And as we will also see, I hope, from Jonson, humanist poetry means poetry that makes you a better humanist, which means it makes you more learned, it makes you more dignified, it makes you worthier to enter, as it were, into the humanist library, worthier even to read poetry like Ben Jonson's. So he really cares about that. In fact, Jonson certainly thinks of himself, I think, as a very fine humanist, an exemplary humanist, we could even say. And Jonson, I think, definitely thinks of his poetry as exemplary humanist poetry. I really want to underline that in part because of the reaction that I know we can have and are absolutely entitled to have when we start reading Ben Jonson's poetry. Because the reaction that we can have, and again are entitled to have, and in fact, which I encourage you to have, if you are so inclined, the reaction may be one of being a little bit underwhelmed, right? And a very useful technique in that regard is to contrast Jonson's poetry with poetry by some of his contemporaries, and we can mention two obvious ones, Shakespeare and Donne. Jonson, as we'll discuss later on, has very, very mixed feelings about Shakespeare, less mixed feelings about Donne, but again, Donne's poetry, well, you know what it's like when you're reading Donne's poetry. There's a lot of, whiz and a lot of bang and a lot of kapow and a lot of ha ha ha, and a lot of oh Donne, and a lot of ah. It's a reactive experience in a way that is fun, and we feel like we're having, well, a good time when we're reading John Donne's poetry. I hope, even if it's kind of a mind-puzzling time, a lot of it. Jonson's poetry is not like that. Okay. And so again, when we first turn to Jonson's poetry, we may find ourselves not going, wow, that was awesome. We may rather find ourselves kind of going, what? What happened there? I don't get it. If we are having that reaction, if we have that reaction, from my point of view, that is, well, to put it crudely, a very good thing, because that gives us something really cool to work with in our encounter with Jonson. If we're a bit underwhelmed, well, he wants to talk to us, because as far as Jonson is concerned, these poems are perfect, you guys, okay? So that gives us, again, an opportunity just to try to understand what makes them so great from Jonson's, again, exemplary humanist perspective. So I want to start with the poetry selection that I have given you. It's a very, very restricted selection from Jonson's absolutely voluminous poetic production. A poetic production, moreover, that he packaged and presented very carefully. So there's a whole other kind of story that we could tell there about the status of publishing, actually, in the early modern period. Publishing your work, and again, contrast will work for us. A guy like Donne, Jonson's near contemporary. These guys knew each other. Jonson basically admires Donne, I think, although they're very, very different. But a guy like Donne does not publish his poetry during his lifetime. Why? Because it ain't cool, okay? And if you're John Donne, you're just way too cool for that. And that's that attitude of being too cool for school, or at least too cool for the print shop, that's very much one that Donne cultivated around himself and people like him. So when you read a John Donne poem like The Flea, for example, which we didn't look at in this course, but which you guys have probably seen in other classes at one time or another, a poem like The Flea, it's a kind of brilliant body, yet extremely sophisticated joke. And the attitude that poem cultivates is, it's kind of like, Donne wrote that down on the back of a napkin after being at the bar with his friends or something. And, hey, I wrote a poem, and yeah, it's nothing. And give it to your friends, and your friends read it and they go, oh, that's so witty, oh, John, and they write it down in a book and pass it on like that. That's what we call in the business coterie poetry, which means a poetry that is written within a little clique of really hip kids, and they just share it around amongst themselves, not caring about publishing it, because that ain't cool. What's cool is sharing your poetry amongst your fellow hipsters. Jonson's not like that. Jonson engaged from very early on in his career in a very careful program of publishing his work in print, and then later this becomes an aspect of his work in which he's bringing out big volumes of his poetry and plays, calling them his works. Very expensively produced books, very beautiful, incredible engravings on the cover and so on. So, it's worth knowing about that for our purposes, because it's consistent with Renaissance humanism. Let's put it this way. It's consistent with Renaissance humanism to be too cool for cool, okay? So John Donne, rebel John Donne, Catholic John Donne, womanizer, okay, cool cat for sure. But Jonson would conceive himself as being at a higher level than Donne, a much more mature level, a much more serious and grave level. And at that level, sure, of course you want to publish your work, because Well, first of all, it's great and perfect. Uh, but second of all, and more importantly, because as we'll see, the point of the work is to improve people, to improve the people who read it. They can't be improved if you don't publish it. And so that humanist project is, for a guy like Jonson, very much one that is elite in one way, but also has to be publicly available, publicly directed. It's supposed to make people and society better. And of course, one thing that frustrated Jonson a great deal was that people didn't always feel they were being made better by his poetry, or certainly by his plays, as we will see. Okay, I'm rambling in a rather general, abstract way. I want to turn to the text. Again, as usual, when I do a lecture like this, just via YouTube, I'm not going to be able to share the text with you on the screen. We'll do that on Thursday, and I will ask you guys just to follow along with the stuff that I've given you on Canvas. I'm going to start with the poetry, because I think if we go through this selection of Jonson's poetry, what happens is, again, as I've said, we're able to fill in some of the details of the Renaissance humanist attitude, I think in really quite an interesting way, and again, based in part on the possibly underwhelming effect that the poems may initially have on us. After we've done that, I want to turn to Jonson's theoretical writings. He wrote a long work of kind of literary criticism / theory called Timber, or Discoveries. Discoveries doesn't exactly mean things he's found out or dug out of the ground. It means something more like revealings or maybe teachings. So Timber or Discoveries, that's Jonson as a mature poet and intellectual, telling us what he's learned about his business. But let's begin with the poems. I just want to say one more introductory rambly thing before we do that. Jonson wants us to see how great his work is. He wants influence, literary and cultural influence. And although in some areas of his life and work, Jonson was frustrated in that regard, especially in some areas of his work as a playwright, overall, I think we have to say that Jonson was successful, and even successful in his lifetime, at gaining very, very considerable influence, becoming the center toward the end of his life of a large kind of rambunctious group of poets who called themselves the Tribe of Ben. And that meant that they tried to be like Ben, write like him, drink like him, but really be a humanist like him. And posthumously also, Jonson had tremendous influence. And, Jonson had this intense rivalry with Shakespeare. Shakespeare really is, well, almost the anti-Ben Jonson. There's a lot of things in Shakespeare that Jonson will tell us are exactly not the way that poetry should be, or plays should be. But in their lifetimes, Shakespeare was far more successful, certainly as a playwright, than Jonson was. People loved Shakespeare's plays. They made tons of money. Jonson had some successes, but the plays he really cared about, people kind of hated, and that made him really, really mad. However, later, as I've said, Jonson's posthumous influence was tremendous, and much more than Shakespeare's. The 18th century, for the most part, does not really understand Shakespeare. The 18th century did understand Ben Jonson, and so we can probably state that Jonson's influence, the taste for Jonson, let's say, extends all the way through the 18th century, all the way to his namesake, his neoclassical namesake, Samuel Jonson, at the end of the 18th century, and all the way up to the kind of, verge of Romanticism in the early 19th century, which is a reaction against that neoclassical taste that goes back to Ben Jonson. So when we line it up in terms of the literary history, it's really quite a big deal, I think. The Jonson's kind of excellence, which had this tremendous influence for, let's say, 100 years or more after his death. Only being overturned with the coming of the Romantic period, and there again we will find some tremendously interesting and important contrasts between what the Romantics think makes a poet, makes a genius, makes a poem, and so on. Between that attitude and the Johnsonian attitude, the Renaissance humanist attitude. Okay, let's turn to these little poems. And the very first one I've given you, I have, again, it's a highly restricted selection from Jonson's works, but at the same time a selection which is kind of leading us into his book, a little bit like the work that we did with Herbert's The Temple. So let's just imagine it this way. We're opening, as it were, Jonson's poetry, and we're going to begin our look at it with a little poem, 2 lines long, a little epigram called To the Reader. So he addresses us and says, "Pray thee, take care that takest my book in hand, to read it well, that is, to understand. Pray thee, take care that takes my book in hand, to read it well, that is, to understand." It's absolutely characteristic of Jonson's version, at least, of Renaissance humanism, that his book of poetry does not begin with an address to the reader which says anything like, "Hey guys, I hope you like these poems." Or even, "Hey guys, we're going to have some fun today." No. Johnson's poetry begins with an address to the reader which says, "Hey, I hope you can do this right." Okay? If you're reading my book, I hope you're going to read it well. And by that I mean I hope you're not going to be an idiot about it, reader. Take care to understand. You see, the onus is actually placed on us, the reader, to kind of come up to Jonson's level of Renaissance humanism. And by the same token, from Jonson's point of view, which after all he is putting very, very frankly here, right? He's not being coy about it. From Jonson's point of view, if we don't understand his poetry, well, that's really on us, right? We haven't done the work properly. So that reaction of maybe a bit of underwhelmness that we may have when we begin our encounter with Jonson, I've insisted that's really, really kind of valuable, but certainly that does not make Jonson happy. You are not being a good humanist reader of Jonson's humanist poetry unless you are reading it well. The onus is on us. Now, the next little poem, Jonson addresses his book. This is a quite a conventional kind of text in the Renaissance. It's a poem that we call an envoi, which means a poem by which you kind of send the book away, send the book out into the world. So he addresses his book. And specifically here, he's speaking sort of to the first portion of his overall works. So it's a book within a book, and it's called Epigrams. It's a collection of epigrams, which are short poems of social satire, usually pithy and kind of memorable, and often a bit ironic and fun, and sometimes quite mean and scurrilous. This is a satirical tradition that goes back to classical times, so it's a very humanist kind of thing to write. A whole bunch of epigrams. But it's also a genre or subgenre of epigrams that sets up certain expectations And these are the expectations that Jonson addresses in this poem. He says to his book, "It will be looked for, book, when some but see thy title, epigrams, and named of me, thou shouldst be bold, licentious, full of gall, wormwood and sulphur, sharp and toothed withal. Become a petulant thing, hurl ink and wit as madmen's stones, not caring whom they hit. Deceive their malice who could wish it so, and by thy wiser temper let men know thou art not so covetous of least self-fame, made from the hazard of another's shame, much less with lewd, profane, and beastly phrase to catch the world's loose laughter or vain gaze. He that departs with his own honesty for vulgar praise doth it too dearly buy." So the expectations that Jonson is addressing, the expectations for a book of epigrams, as he says in the first part of this poem, are that a book of epigrams will be bold, licentious, full of gall, wormwood and sulphur, sharp and toothed withal, hurling ink and wit as madmen's stones, not caring whom they hit. Fantastic image, I think. So that's what Jonson says to the book. When people see you, book, and see that you're Ben Jonson's epigrams, they're going to think you're really, a street fighter, really dangerous, really, offensive, really uncaringly, cruelly, relentlessly satirical. But deceive their malice who could wish it so, he tells the book. In other words, show them how wrong they are. People who think that's the kind of book you're going to be. Show them instead that you're not one bit interested in becoming famous by embarrassing anybody or mocking anybody. Not so covetous of least self-fame, made from the hazard of another's shame. Even less interested in lewd, profane, or beastly phrase. No. Jonson says, you, book, are going to be a book of properly humanist epigrams, and that means, among other things, epigrams that are dignified, honest, and morally improving. And already in our work with Jonson, one of those details that I have been gesturing toward that allow us to fill in the brief sketch of Renaissance humanism begins to become clear. And that is, as I've said several times in different ways, but I just want to make it really explicit. Renaissance humanism, it's a literary cultural program. It's about studying the culture of ancient Greece and Rome, literature of ancient Greece and Rome, and bringing that, as it were, up to date in English in the late 16th, early 17th centuries. But it's also very much a moral program. A Renaissance humanist text is supposed to be a morally improving text, not one that hurts you or makes you feel dirty or makes you wonder if you should have laughed at that. No. It's supposed to leave you better than you were before, leave you more dignified, leave you more kind of fully evolved than you were before. If I can speak very anachronistically, obviously Jonson has no concept of evolution. But yes, he that departs with his own honesty for vulgar praise doth it too dearly buy. I'm not going to become famous, Jonson says, just by being vulgar. No, I'm going to do it in the proper, morally improving humanist way. The next poem that I have in the selection, Jonson addresses his bookseller, saying to this person, "Thou that makest gain thy end, and wisely well, callst a book good or bad as it doth sell, use mine so too, I give thee leave." You hear that? I'm going to allow you to sell my book, bookseller. Very, very generous, Ben. "I give thee leave, but crave," so I only ask, "but crave, for the luck's sake it thus much favour have, to lie upon my stall till it be sought. not offered, as it made suit to be bought. Nor have my title leaf on posts or walls, or in cleft sticks, advanced to make calls for termers, law students, or some clerk-like serving man who scarce can spell thard names, whose knight less can. If without these vile arts it will not sell, this book, send it to Bucklesbury, there 'twill well. Bucklesbury, basically that means a landfill, someplace where you throw garbage, a dumping ground. In the middle part of this poem, Jonson is giving us actually quite an interesting little glimpse of the nature of the early 17th century book trade in London. He's giving us a little glimpse of the marketing of books in early modern London, which included things like pasting the title page, the title leaf. So you would print extra title pages for advertising purposes. Print the title page on posts or walls all over the city, just like nowadays people put up posters for concerts or whatever, or lectures. That's something that was done, pasting up title pages so people would see that and think, oh, Ben Jonson's epigrams, that sounds pretty cool, I want to get a copy of that. Or even paying people to walk around with the title page in a cleft stick, so like a sandwich board, right? Imagine that. Ben Jonson's epigrams now available, stuff like that. So this little glimpse of the marketing of books in early modern London. But of course, what's so wonderful here is Jonson saying to the bookseller, "Don't do any of that crap. Don't do that for my book, bookseller. I'm gonna let you sell it." But not if you advertise it. That's what this astonishingly and arrogantly humanist poem is saying. People should come and look for my book because it's my book. And what I want you to do, bookseller, is just let my book lie on your bookstall until people come asking for it. Because those will be the ones, I suppose, is the thought, who will be worthy of my work. But no advertising, because that's beneath me. And hey, if that doesn't work, throw it out. I don't care. The haughtiness of Jonson's humanist attitude is certainly very remarkable, but he's completely committed to the idea that the improving virtue and the literary virtue of his work should speak for itself. That's the only way that it's acceptable to him. And if that doesn't work, it doesn't work. Very, very lofty attitude. Okay, the next two poems I've given in our selection I'm not going to read. There's one called To King James and one called On the Union. That's the union of England and Scotland, which became at least a de facto thing when James VI of Scotland became James I of England also in 1603. I'm not going to read these, but I have them here in our selection because I want to make, again, a point about another one of the details that fills in the sketch of Renaissance humanism, at least from Jonson's perspective, the way Jonson sees and tries to exemplify and embody it. And this is a political detail. Renaissance humanism is profoundly conservative, okay? Politically conservative. I mean, and even explicitly so, in a way that does not go without saying in the period. By which I mean, again, Shakespeare, again, a nice contrast. Shakespeare, I think, is by no means a political radical, whatever that would even mean in early modern England. But you don't find Shakespeare really kind of showing his political colors at all. He just has other interests. He's not thinking about that much, for the most part, I think. Jonson does show his colors in these poems on King James and on the Union. These are poems of praise. So the poems of James, and he writes a number of poems on James, King James. who presented himself as a humanist himself. James's self-image and public image was one of being a humanist prince, so an intellectual ruler. And Jonson's attitude toward that is yes, yes, boss, go boss. You are the greatest boss. That's what a poem like that one on King James says, and absolutely sincerely. So we must not suppose when we're reading Jonson praising the king that there's any kind of hidden agenda. No. Renaissance humanism is a profoundly and again explicitly conservative, politically conservative impulse for the most part. And that means that it is a political vision in which the poet, the humanist poet, is meant really to live in an intimacy with power and in a dialogue with power. So I was saying earlier in this lecture that if we look at humanism in historical retrospective, so if we look back at Renaissance humanism from a romantic attitude, for example, a 19th century romantic attitude, well, the romantics, of course, are going to teach us that poets, artists, creative people of all kinds have to almost exist and operate in an antipathy with power. Poets are speaking truth to power in the cliche that we still have. Poets are rebels. Poets are revolutionaries in the late 18th, early 19th century romantic vision. The humanist vision from this earlier period is exactly the opposite. The poet is somebody who should live in an intimacy with power, on friendly terms with it, as I have said, and even in a kind of advisory role to power. That is something that is glimpsed, desired, let's say, in Renaissance humanism. Jonson, I think, doesn't exactly want that role. Other members of the Renaissance humanist club in English literature certainly do. Spenser, for example, Edmund Spenser, a near contemporary of Jonson, certainly seems to crave a quasi-advisory role for himself and his poetry within the Elizabethan court. Never gets that or even comes close to it, but it seems to be something that he fantasizes about a great deal. Anyway, for our purposes, the main point at this moment, again, is poetry close to power, intimate with it, not critical of it in any way. And in fact, a kind of coda to that point, as I've mentioned several times today, Ben Jonson had to some extent a successful career in the earlier part of his career in the professional theatre in London, the public theatre in London, where he's a rival to Shakespeare and so on. Mostly through his comedies, which people seem to have quite liked. Later on, Jonson moved on to do what he thought of was his real work, which was writing these massively serious classical tragedies, what we call Senecan tragedies, and people hated those. So he actually left the public theater and went to work for the king, writing texts called masques, which are these weird kind of closed circuit musicals put on in the royal court for the royal court. Although Jonson, as I said, never really seems to have had this idea of taking up an advisory role re political power, he certainly made his living from it in the latter part of his career and was actually very close to it. Okay, next two poems, to William Camden and then to the Learned Critic. And actually, I think I'll take the second one first, to the Learned Critic. Critic here meaning something like what it means for us today, not necessarily a fellow poet or playwright, but rather a learned humanist who knows what's good and is in a position to tell others what's good when it comes to contemporary literature. So Jonson, the great humanist poet, addresses the critic, and based perhaps on expectations that we bring to Jonson, modern expectations I mean, about the relationship between creative artists and critics, and based on also partly on the stuff I've already been saying here today, we might suspect that when Jonson turns to the learned critic, we might expect that he would say to him, "You'd better like my work because it's perfect," right? But no, this is what he says to the learned critic. He says, "May others fear, fly, and traduce thy name as guilty men do magistrates. Glad I, that wish my poems a legitimate fame, charge them for crown to thy sole censure high." High, I should have given you a note there. High, H-I-E, means run or scurry. And but a sprig of bays given by thee shall outlive garlands stolen from the chaste tree. So Jonson's saying, look, other writers may not want their work to come under your eye, O learned critic. But me, absolutely. You're the only reader I really want, actually. If I could, as he says in that somewhat difficult middle section of this little poem, if I could, I would send my poems only to be read by you. And that's, as I said, kind of maybe a bit surprising, because we might expect a guy like Ben Jonson to say, "How dare you judge my poems?" But what he's saying instead is, okay, if you're really a learned humanist, then you will love my poems. And the love for my poems of a learned humanist is exactly the love for my poems that I want. So Jonson sees a continuity between his work and the work of the learned critic, and he's quite content, actually, to submit his work to the censure, the judgment of the learned critic. And this allows us to fill in another detail, again, of this humanist sketch. And again, it's a detail that will be usefully backlit from other periods, from other expectations, including romantic expectations. We may have the idea still today, which I think basically has a romantic heritage, that creativity, the work of the artist, it comes from kind of a dark and unknowable place in the psyche. It's different, and different in kind, I mean, from the intellectual work of a scientist or an historian or even an English professor. The work of the artist is more opaque, is in some ways more oppressive, in some ways less rational. So we have this idea, I think, still today, and it basically comes from, again, a capital R romantic heritage. We have this idea of there being a kind of opposition, or at least a distinction, between rational, intellectual, analytical work, learning, let's say, and, fascinating, deep, dark, crazy, creative work. And again, that is one that simply does not obtain or is inside out in Renaissance humanism. In Renaissance humanism, the activity of the poet is an expression of learning. It's totally continuous with the humanist classroom. It's totally continuous with the work of the learned critic. So again, for Jonson, he and the learned critic, they're not exactly the same kind of intellectual worker, but they're doing, broadly speaking, the same kind of intellectual work under the umbrella of Renaissance humanism. Now, the other poem that we have here under this general heading is Jonson's poem to William Camden. And there is a fair bit for us to work with here, so much that I think I prefer for the most part to leave the Camden poem for our seminar on Thursday. But I'll just say now, William Camden had been Jonson's teacher. So a very, very important person in Jonson's life, somebody who seems to have noticed, young Ben as being a kid with tremendous promise, and made Jonson into the humanist that he became. And William Camden was a great and a famous humanist in his own right. So Jonson writes this poem to him, praising his teacher and praising him precisely as a great humanist, as well as the person to whom Jonson really owes his whole life. And again, I for the most part, I want to leave this poem until Thursday because there's quite a lot that we can do with it. I just want to I want to draw your attention to one aspect of the poem, one phrase, and then make one general observation about it and then move on. The phrase I want to draw your attention to, it's round about the middle of the poem. It's line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. End of the 8th line, 7th and 8th lines, where Jonson says to Camden, "What name, what skill, what faith hast thou in things? What sight in searching the most antique springs?" Antique springs is the phrase that I want to draw your attention to because it is a quintessentially humanist phrase. One of the slogans you get in Renaissance humanism is the slogan in Latin, ad fontes, and I'll put that on the Canvas page. It means to the sources, ad fontes, to the sources or to the springs. And what that means in Renaissance humanism is that it's a tremendous archival movement as well as a pedagogic movement. The signature Renaissance humanist activity almost is to search out original versions and editions in the original languages of the classical texts, above all, that had shaped the European tradition down to the 16th century. So you're not supposed to accept bogus redactions or transmissions of things. You're supposed to go to the sources, ad fontes. That's just a very, very famous and, as I said, quintessentially humanist attitude. So I wanted to draw your attention to that. And then the general observation that I'll make before I move on. The poem to William Camden, let me put it this way to you guys. Jonson is very, very proud of this poem, I would say. This, almost above all of the poems that I've given you, this for Jonson, I think, would have a good claim to be a perfect humanist poem, the poem to William Camden. So I would like us on Thursday to talk about why that is, what's so great about it. And if we examine it fairly closely, I think we learn some quite interesting things about what Jonson, qua Renaissance humanist, thinks matters in the way that words can be arranged into these artifacts that we call poems. And moving on, there's several other poems here again which I would like us to discuss for the most part on Thursday. First of all, these are famous little poems. Jonson's two laments for two children who died in childbirth, one a daughter, the other a son, and didn't die in childbirth, but died in very early childhood, which of course is a very, very common thing that happens in the early modern period. And again, these are some very interesting texts in terms of their performance of Renaissance humanist excellence. And I have just received a message from my iPad that I'm on low battery because I forgot to plug it in, so that's pretty dumb. So let us surge forward. I want to look at the poems on his children, my first son and my first daughter, together on Thursday. And similarly, the long and very famous Inviting a Friend to Supper, I would like us to look at on Thursday. All I will say about them again is, and Inviting a Friend to Supper is a really, really useful one for our purposes in this respect. This again is a poem of which Jonson, I think, is extremely proud, Inviting a Friend to Supper. And this again is an intensely, roundly, robustly humanist poem. And so on Thursday, let's talk a bit about what makes it that way, okay? Now, I have some more stuff that I want to say, but I'm going to actually stop talking now and end this particular tape, because I'm running out of battery, as I said. And then I will do another little bit on the theoretical readings that we have from Jonson, because I do want to have those on the table before we meet on Thursday. But for now, I'm going to pause there. Thank you.